I should have known something was off the moment I saw her picture on the missing persons report. The woman, Laura Hastings, was in her early 30s, a successful businesswoman with a stellar reputation in the tech industry. She was last seen leaving her office late one night, her sleek black sedan disappearing into the city's labyrinthine streets. Her husband, distraught and frantic, filed the report after she didn't return home. The details in the file were sparse, no signs of foul play, no ransom note, nothing to suggest what could have happened. But something about her smile in the photo unnerved me. It was too perfect, too practiced, like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror 1,000 times. As I stared at that picture in my dimly lit office, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was my first real lead in weeks. After digging through her background, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No financial troubles, no enemies, just a woman living her life at the top of her game. But the deeper I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. Her records were flawless, almost too flawless, as if they had been carefully curated by someone with something to hide. I decided to start with her closest contacts, friends, colleagues, her husband. The husband was the first to crack. During our interview, I noticed his eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine. When I pressed him, he finally admitted that Laura had become increasingly secretive in the months leading up to her disappearance. She would receive strange phone calls late at night and leave the house for hours without explanation. He had tried following her once, but she had shaken him off easily, disappearing into a part of town she had no business being in. My gut told me there was more to this story than a simple disappearance. I dug further into Laura's past, calling in favors, accessing databases not exactly open to the public. What I found made my blood run cold. Laura Hastings didn't exist before 5 years ago. No records, no history, nothing. The woman who everyone knew as Laura Hastings had built a life out of thin air. But whose life was she living? One night, I received a call from an anonymous number. The voice on the other end was raspy, whispering like it didn't want to be heard. It told me to stop looking, that it wasn't safe. Before I could ask anything, the line went dead, leaving me in the suffocating silence of my office. I sat there for a moment, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I'd dealt with all kinds of threats in my line of work, but this felt different, more sinister, more personal. I glanced at Laura's picture on my desk, her eyes staring back at me with that perfect, hollow smile. Something told me that this was just the beginning, and whatever I was about to uncover, it wasn't going to be pretty. But I couldn't stop now. I needed to know who Laura Hastings really was, and why she had gone through such lengths to hide her true identity. And more importantly, what had happened to the real Laura, the one whose identity had been stolen. As I prepared to delve deeper into the dark underbelly of Laura's life, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The drive to the storage facility felt like an eternity, the city's lights blurring into streaks as I navigated through the winding streets. The address I found behind the picture frame had been nagging at me, like a splinter in my mind. Whatever was hidden there, I knew it was important, something that would unravel the twisted web I had stumbled into. The facility was tucked away on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. It was the kind of place where secrets were buried, both literally and figuratively. The chain-link fence surrounding it rattled in the wind, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I parked my car and approached the main gate, using the silver key I had found to unlock the padlock. The unit number matched the one scrawled on the paper. As I stood in front of it, a wave of dread washed over me, making my heart pound in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something I wasn't prepared to see. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and slid it open. The heavy metal screeched as it moved, the sound echoing through the empty facility. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something far more pungent, decay. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing stacks of boxes and old furniture covered in dust. It was an ordinary sight, but the stench told a different story. I moved deeper into the unit, my footsteps crunching on the concrete floor. In the far corner, half hidden beneath a tattered tarp, was a large trunk. Its surface was scratched and worn, the brass latches tarnished with age. I hesitated before kneeling beside it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence around me was oppressive, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I forced myself to open the trunk, and the moment I did, the smell hit me full force, almost knocking me back. I gagged, turning my head away, but I had to see what was inside. I shone the flashlight into the trunk, and my blood ran cold. A body lay crumpled at the bottom, wrapped in plastic, its features unrecognizable from the advanced state of decomposition. The skin was mottled and gray, the hands curled into claws. Whoever this had been, they had been dead for a long time. But there was no doubt in my mind, this was the real Laura Hastings. My mind reeled as I staggered back, trying to process what I was seeing. The woman I had been investigating, the one who had disappeared, wasn't who she claimed to be. The Laura Hastings everyone knew had been dead for years, her identity stolen by someone else. But who? And why? I needed to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was jarring in the silent storage unit, making me jump. I fumbled for it, my hands slick with sweat. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number, "You're too late." My heart skipped a beat. Whoever had sent the message knew I was here. I glanced around the unit, the shadows seeming to shift and move in the corners of my vision. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. As I sprinted to my car, the weight of what I had discovered pressed down on me. The real Laura Hastings was dead, her life stolen by someone who had gone to extreme lengths to cover their tracks. And now, I was caught in the middle of it, a target in a game I didn't understand. I drove back to the city, my thoughts racing. I needed to find out who this impostor was and why she had taken Laura's identity. But more importantly, I needed to figure out why she was watching me, and what she was planning to do next. As I pulled into a quiet side street, trying to gather my thoughts, my phone buzzed again. Another text, from the same number, "She's already coming for you." The streetlights flickered ominously as I read the message, the darkness closing in around me. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that there was no way out of this. She was already one step ahead, and now, she was coming for me. I knew then that I couldn't run. The only way to survive was to confront her, to dig deeper into the identity she had stolen and uncover the truth before it was too late. But as I stared into the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was far more terrifying than anything I had imagined. The following day, I found myself parked a block away from Laura Hastings' suburban home. The quiet neighborhood was a stark contrast to the dark revelations from the night before. Children played in the yards, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries as they passed each other on the sidewalk. It was hard to believe that just beyond the manicured lawns and white picket fences, something so sinister had taken root. I sat in the car, staring at the house that had once belonged to the real Laura Hastings. It was a two-story, modern structure, the kind of place where everything looked perfect on the outside. But I knew better now. The real Laura was dead, and the woman living in that house was a fraud, a cold-blooded impostor. With a deep breath, I exited the car and approached the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The driveway was empty, and the blinds were drawn tightly shut, giving no indication of whether anyone was home. I had no plan, no backup, just the overwhelming need to confront the woman who had taken over Laura's life. I reached the front door and paused, listening. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every sound. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles could meet the wood, the door creaked open. It wasn't fully closed, just slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to lock it. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house was eerily still, the air thick with the scent of lavender masking something far more unpleasant. I stepped into the foyer, my senses on high alert. The silence was broken only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. I moved through the rooms cautiously, the unease growing with each step. The interior was just as pristine as I had imagined. Tasteful furniture, expensive decor, and not a speck of dust in sight. But there was something unsettling about the perfection, like it was a carefully constructed facade hiding something rotten underneath. In the living room, I noticed a large mirror hanging on the wall, reflecting the room back at me in distorted, elongated angles. It made the space feel smaller, almost claustrophobic. I turned away from the mirror and noticed a bookshelf in the corner, its shelves lined with books that looked more decorative than read. But one of the books was out of place, slightly pulled forward as if someone had been in a hurry. I reached out and tugged the book from the shelf. It was a hardcover copy of The Art of Deception, the same title I'd seen before. As I flipped through the pages, a piece of paper fell out, fluttering to the floor. I bent down to pick it up and felt a chill run down my spine. It was a photograph, old and weathered, showing a woman standing in front of a farmhouse. Her face was unmistakable, it was the real Laura Hastings. But the photo was decades old, and something about it was deeply wrong. The background was blurred, as if the world around her was melting away. And in the bottom corner, someone had scrawled the words, "She's watching you." My blood turned to ice. The words felt like a warning, a taunt from the impostor who was lurking somewhere nearby. I stuffed the photo back into the book and returned it to the shelf, my mind racing. Who was she? What kind of power did she hold over this identity she had stolen? As I stood there, lost in thought, the sound of creaking floorboards above me snapped me back to reality. Someone was upstairs. I knew I shouldn't stay, that I should leave before I was discovered, but my feet moved on their own. I had to know who, or what, was up there. I climbed the staircase, each step slow and deliberate, the weight of dread growing heavier with every inch. The upper floor was dark, the curtains drawn tightly over the windows. I reached the top and was met with a long hallway lined with closed doors. The creaking sound had come from the room at the far end. I approached the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I reached for the handle, the door suddenly swung open on its own, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare except for a single, large mirror that covered the entire opposite wall. I froze in the doorway, staring into the reflection. The room behind me looked exactly the same, but in the mirror, I saw her, the impostor. She stood behind me, her face a perfect replica of the woman in the photograph, but with eyes that glinted with malice. She smiled, a slow, twisted grin that sent shivers down my spine. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around to find the room empty, the impostor nowhere to be seen. Panic gripped me as I realized I was trapped. The air in the room grew colder, the light dimming until it was almost pitch black. In the mirror, her reflection moved closer, her expression growing more distorted, more monstrous. I watched in horror as her face began to twist and warp, the skin peeling away to reveal something dark and malevolent underneath. Her eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and she reached out towards me, her hand stretching out from the mirror's surface as if trying to pull me in. I stumbled back, hitting the wall behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew I had to get out, but my legs felt like lead. The impostor's hand was inches from my face, the cold seeping into my skin as she whispered in a voice that was both hers and not hers, "You'll never escape me." With every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged for the door, ripping it open and fleeing down the hallway. I didn't look back as I tore down the stairs, the sound of her laughter echoing in my ears. I burst through the front door, gasping for air as I stumbled into the daylight. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I could still feel her cold breath on my neck, her malevolent presence lingering in the back of my mind. As I sped away from the house, one thing was clear: this wasn't just about a stolen identity anymore. The woman who had taken over Laura Hastings' life was something far more sinister, and she wasn't going to stop until she had claimed mine as well. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, twisted, malevolent, reaching out from the darkness. Her voice, that cold whisper, echoed in my mind, telling me that there was no escape. I kept glancing at the mirror in my bedroom, half expecting to see her staring back at me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Morning came, but the daylight brought no relief. I was running on fumes, my thoughts muddled and frayed, but I knew I couldn't stop now. I had to find out who, or what, this impostor was. There was only one person left who might have answers: the husband. He had been avoiding me since our last conversation, but I had a feeling he knew more than he was letting on. I drove to his house, a modest place in a quiet part of town. The kind of neighborhood where nothing bad ever happens, except it had. I parked down the street and approached the house, feeling that same gnawing sense of unease as before. The blinds were drawn, the lawn overgrown, and the place had an air of abandonment about it. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the empty house. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and waited. Still nothing. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard a shuffling sound from inside. The door creaked open a few inches, and the husband's haggard face appeared in the gap. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and clammy, like a man who had seen too much and slept too little. "What do you want?" he croaked, his voice hoarse and shaky. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know something's wrong, and I think you do too. Please, let me in." For a moment, I thought he might slam the door in my face, but instead, he hesitated, then nodded weakly and stepped aside. I entered the dimly lit house, the stale air thick with the smell of neglect and something sour. The living room was a mess, cluttered with empty bottles, crumpled papers, and a sense of despair that hung in the air like a shroud. He collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. "She'll know." "She always knows." "Who is she?" I asked, sitting down across from him. "The woman who's been living as Laura. Who is she really?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. "I don't know," he whispered. "I thought I did once, but I don't anymore. She's not human. I don't know what she is, but she's not Laura." "Then why did you stay with her?" I pressed. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "Because I loved her. Because I thought I could help her. But then I found out the truth, and it was too late. She had already taken everything, my life, my sanity. I couldn't leave. She wouldn't let me." "What truth?" I asked, leaning in closer. "What did you find out?" He swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached for a photo frame on the coffee table. He handed it to me, his eyes avoiding mine. The photo was of Laura, no, the impostor, smiling brightly at the camera, her arm around the real Laura's shoulders. They looked almost identical, like sisters or twins, but there was a subtle difference, something in the impostor's eyes that set her apart. "I found this in the attic," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was hidden in a box with some old letters and papers. I think the real Laura knew what was happening, but she couldn't stop it. The impostor, she took over, and when the real Laura tried to fight back, she killed her. I found the body, wrapped in plastic in the storage unit." I stared at the photo, the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to come together. The real Laura had discovered the truth about the impostor, her doppelganger, but before she could expose her, she had been silenced. "She's been living in this house ever since, pretending to be Laura, keeping up the act," the husband continued, his voice cracking. "But she's not right. Sometimes, when she thinks I'm not looking, I see her change. Her face, her eyes, they're wrong. And then she looks at me like she knows what I've seen, and I'm too terrified to do anything about it." My blood ran cold. The impostor wasn't just some ordinary con artist or identity thief. She was something else entirely, something not of this world. And now, she was hunting me. Why does she do it? I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Why take over Laura's life? I don't know, he said, shaking his head. Power. Control. Maybe she just enjoys it, the way a predator enjoys toying with its prey before the kill. But whatever her reasons, she won't stop until she has what she wants. What does she want? I asked, but even as I spoke, I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. She wants you, he said, his voice trembling. She's finished with me. She needs a new identity, a new life to consume. And she's chosen you. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as the truth of his words sank in. I had been so focused on finding out who she was that I hadn't realized she was already one step ahead, planning her next move. And now, she was coming for me. The husband suddenly grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. You need to leave, he said urgently. Get out of town, change your name, do whatever you have to do, but don't let her find you. She'll kill you, just like she killed Laura. I pulled away from his grasp, my mind racing. Running seemed like the smart thing to do, but a part of me knew it wouldn't work. She would find me, no matter where I went. And I couldn't let her get away with it, not again. Where is she now? I asked, my voice firm. He hesitated, fear flashing in his eyes. She goes to the old farmhouse sometimes. The one in the photo. I think it's where she first took over Laura's life. She's always there late at night, like she's drawn to it, the farmhouse. The place where it all began. If I was going to stop her, that's where I had to go. I stood up, determination hardening my resolve. Thank you, I said. I'll stop her. I promise. The husband looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. I hope you do, he whispered. But if you don't? God help us all. As I left the house, the air outside felt colder, heavier, as if the world itself was bracing for what was to come. I knew I was walking into a trap, but I had no choice. The impostor had taken over one life already, and I couldn't let her take mine too. The sun dipped below the horizon as I drove toward the farmhouse, the sky darkening like a bruise. I could feel her presence growing stronger, a malevolent force that was already waiting for me in the shadows. Whatever happened next, I knew it would end tonight. The road to the farmhouse was long and winding, cutting through dense woods that seemed to swallow the last of the daylight. The sky had darkened to an ominous shade of purple, and the trees on either side of the road loomed like silent sentinels. As I drove, the weight of what I was about to face settled heavily on my chest. This was it, the final showdown. The farmhouse appeared at the end of the dirt road, a hulking silhouette against the twilight. It was old, weathered by time, with its paint peeling and its windows dark and lifeless. The place had an air of abandonment, as if it had been forgotten by the world. But I knew better. This was where it had all started, where the impostor had taken over Laura's life, and where she intended to finish what she had begun. I parked a distance away, not wanting to announce my presence. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my feet as I approached the farmhouse. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and rot, and the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. I stepped into the main hall, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The interior was a stark contrast to the tidy suburban home where the impostor had lived. This place was a ruin, the floorboards warped, the walls covered in a thin layer of grime. It was as if the farmhouse itself had absorbed the malevolence of its occupant, becoming twisted and decayed, just like her. A faint light flickered from somewhere deeper in the house. I followed it, my footsteps echoing ominously in the silence. The light led me to a room at the back of the house, its door ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, with walls lined with old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and dull. The flickering light came from a single candle placed on a table beside the mirror, its flame dancing erratically in the still air. And there, standing in front of the mirror, was the impostor. She looked just like Laura Hastings, same face, same posture, same cold, calculating eyes. But as she turned to face me, I could see the truth beneath the facade. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light. There was something ancient about her, something not of this world. "You came," she said, her voice smooth and icy. "I was hoping you would." I tightened my grip on the flashlight, trying to steady my nerves. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice echoing off the walls. "Why did you take her life?" She smiled, a slow, twisted smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Who I am doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is that I can be anyone. I can take any life I want, and there's nothing you, or anyone, can do to stop me." "That's where you're wrong," I shot back, taking a step closer. "I know what you are. You're not human. You're some kind of parasite, feeding on the lives of others." Her smile widened, and she let out a low, mocking laugh. "Clever. But it's too late for you. You've already fallen into my trap." Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows lengthened, creeping toward me like living things. I could feel her power growing, the darkness pulsing with her malevolent energy. I backed away, realizing too late that I had underestimated her. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a battle against something far more powerful than I had imagined. She had lured me here, to this place where her strength was at its peak, and now she was ready to claim her next victim. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photograph the husband had given me, the one of the real Laura Hastings standing in front of the farmhouse. "This is the real Laura," I said, holding the photo up. "You can't erase her, no matter how hard you try. Her memory will always be stronger than you." For a moment, the impostor's expression faltered, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the photograph. But then, her smile returned, more sinister than ever. "Memories fade," she hissed. "But I will live on, in another life, another face. And you will be forgotten, just like all the others." With a flick of her wrist, the candle flame flared up, casting long shadows across the room. The mirror behind her began to ripple, its surface warping and twisting as if it were a pool of liquid. I watched in horror as her reflection in the mirror changed, shifting into different faces, some I recognized, others I didn't. Each face was twisted with fear, pain, and despair. "I am everyone," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. "I am no one." I felt a surge of panic, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I was losing this battle, and I knew it. The impostor was too strong, too deeply rooted in this place. She would consume me, just as she had consumed Laura, and then she would move on to the next life, and the next, until there was nothing left of the real world, only her. But then, something caught my eye, a small glimmer of light in the photograph I was holding. I looked down and saw that the real Laura's face in the photo was glowing faintly, her eyes filled with a soft, warm light. It was as if she was trying to tell me something, trying to guide me. I knew what I had to do. With all the strength I could muster, I raised the photograph and held it up to the mirror. "You can't take this from her," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "You can't take her soul." The impostor's eyes widened in shock, and she let out a furious scream as the mirror began to crack, the sound like shattering glass cutting through the air. The faces in the mirror twisted in agony, and the impostor's form began to waver, her features distorting as she fought to maintain her grip on reality. The room was filled with a blinding light, and I felt a rush of energy as the darkness was driven back, the air growing warmer, the shadows retreating. The impostor's screams grew louder, more desperate, as her form disintegrated before my eyes, dissolving into a swirl of smoke and light. And then, with one final, agonized cry, she was gone. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the fragments scattering across the floor. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight of the impostor's presence lifted at last. I stood there, breathless and trembling, staring at the spot where she had been. The photograph in my hand was still glowing, the real Laura's face serene and peaceful. I knew she was finally free, her soul at peace after so many years of torment. The farmhouse was quiet now, the malevolent energy that had filled it dissipating into the night. I left the room, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion as I stepped outside into the cool night air. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The impostor was gone, her reign of terror over. But I also knew that the scars she had left behind would take time to heal. I got into my car and started the engine, the farmhouse receding into the distance as I drove away. The night was still and quiet, the stars twinkling overhead. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: the real Laura Hastings could finally rest in peace.